Welcome, everyone. I'm Shah, and today we're going to talk about how tech consultants can price their services for value instead of their time. And joining me for this conversation is Jason Liu, an ML consultant who has fully transitioned his pricing from hourly based to value based, and in the process has earned six-figure months over the past, I don't know, let's say year or so. So thank you so much, Jason, for joining me and sharing your insights and experience with the community.
Thanks, Shah. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
So, for people watching this, Jason, and they're trying to figure out, should I watch this hour-long podcast interview kind of thing? What is one key takeaway they can expect to get from this conversation if they make it to the end?
There's actually two things that I really want people to come away believing. The first one is that there is a price where both people will get paid and they will thank each other. That's the first thing you realize. Like, it's not the case that you charge someone a price, you got away with it, and now they're sort of bitter that they gave you so much money. There is a world where they actually thank you. And the second thing is, when it comes to pricing, it's not just about how much you make, but actually how much you can offer. So if someone says you double your prices, your only job is to figure out what you can offer at that price point and what other services or what other add-ons you can bring to them, rather than just thinking about like, what am I worth? Those are the two things that have really changed the way I think about how I think about pricing and how I think about my services.
I really like that, and I'm sure we're going to get into that more in the conversation. But before we kind of dive into the details, you kind of call this value-based pricing as opposed to hourly-based pricing. So just at a high level, what is value-based pricing?
So value-based pricing fundamentally is changing the way we think about price. We go from what am I worth to what is this problem and what is the solution worth to my customer. A simple example that I've always given was when I charged on time, I was helping this company hire. I was charging them like $700 an hour for a job interview. I was like, oh my God, they're paying me so much money. At the end of it, they had paid me about $14,000. I thought, wow, I really did a great job. I can't believe I got to do this. This is a little bit ridiculous. We made 5 hires. And it turns out that the recruiter made $200,000 because what the recruiter does is the recruiter is getting paid on a percentage of the salary of the employee, like 20% of the salary, if the employee stays for longer than 3 months. So what the recruiter understood is what does the company get? They're going to get a headcount. Whereas I was solely thinking about like, what was my time worth to me? What was my time worth to them? And how can I sell more of my time? And had I known that, maybe I could have asked for a percentage and as a result help with things like recruiting or selling the company or selling the employee on the work that they were doing and understand a little bit more. Those are all what I can do if I understood the value I was bringing to a company rather than how much I was worth or how much I wanted to cost or how much I wanted to make.
And this is something that you changed my perspective on the first time we talked, which is you told me that the value you provide to your client has less to do with your skills and more to do with the scale of your client's problems. And I
Mhm.
don't remember the exact example you gave me, but the example I've been giving people afterward is like if I were to build like a Tableau dashboard for like a data analyst portfolio or something like
Yeah.
that, it would have pretty low value. Maybe that'll help me get a job or something like that. But if I was using those skills to build a dashboard for some VC that is allocating like hundreds of millions of dollars in investment decisions, that dashboard could generate tremendous value for that client. So it's the same skill set, but depending on
Exactly.
where it's applied, it can have significantly different value.
Yeah, it's like, the outcome you're looking for is going to be a matter of force times leverage. And chances are we can dramatically change how much leverage we have, but we might not be able to, change how much force we have, right? I could be a 20% better, machine learning engineer, but there's a chance I can probably make 20 times more return based on carefully selecting the problems you work on.
Why do you think this is so hard for people? Because when I first started freelancing, like when I was in grad school, it was all like me, me, me. Like, what jobs can I do? What skills do I have? Why is it so hard for people to think more about the impact and the value that they're generating for people?
I think generally, two things, right? Everyone starts off trading time for money. There's no one who really just starts off and feels like they're worth a percentage of the business. Right? But even then, if you think about, modern compensation in tech, there is a cash component to do your 40 hours a week, but there is an equity component. And that equity component in some ways is value-based pricing. If you're an early employee, they might give you 2 or 3% of the company because now they know like what the incentives are, right? And it turns out the owner of the company might own 30% of the company because that's how much they're responsible for the final result. In some ways, it is communicating their accountability for the final result rather than just the time it takes to get the work done. And what happens is as you become more of an entrepreneur, you realize you go from trading time for money to just sort of making good decisions. and allocating capital and making bets. When you start thinking about the world in terms of making bets within your business, that's when things sort of really click for the first time. It's okay, I'm going to invest $40,000 into making these couple of bets in hopes that they're going to make me $90,000. What's the ROI? Okay, it's 20%. Can someone make that more likely by charging me $3,000? If they can, I might take that offer. Thinking about yourself as an entrepreneur rather than an employee.
Yeah, okay. This employee to entrepreneur mindset shift. We're kind of brought up in the world as individual contributors, but
Exactly.
it wasn't until you started to think, because you were running your own business and you
Yeah.
were starting to slowly learn this entrepreneur mindset, you could project that onto your clients because they're doing the same exact thing. I want to pivot to like talking about value specifically. Value can
Mhm.
be kind of like this nebulous term. So, how should we think about it? And how can we translate this value into a dollar figure and ultimately
Yeah.
help us with pricing?
So the dollar figure is always going to be hard because really what you're going to be asking for is a percentage of the outcome. And at least when you're starting off, my goal really isn't to find that percentage necessarily, but just to figure out of the price you're currently charging, what percentage is that and is it reasonable? And so, for example, maybe you find out you want to charge $20,000 for a project. And then you have a couple conversations with them and they say, oh, what do you think? What do you think this is going to unlock for the company? And they say, oh, this is going to unlock like $50 million worth of revenue. Okay, now maybe you're not charging enough, right? Maybe if you convinced yourself that you could be 1% accountable for that problem, what does that number look like? Is it in the same ballpark? Do you feel comfortable offering something in that range? But if the same problem is, I don't know, we're just looking, we're just trying things on, then maybe it's not the right customer. So that's the real goal. I don't think the goal is to figure out what the right number is because that's going to be the sliding scale of like a bunch of other things, but that's sort of the general idea. When it comes to actually value, there's kind of two equations I think about. The first one is Alex Hormozy's value equation, which is that value is equal to the dream outcome times the likelihood of success divided by time and effort. And so if I can make your problem more likely, there's more value. If I can show you a bigger dream, there's more value. If I can make it take half the effort and half the time, there's more value. And so you can communicate value by just, phrasing your offer to address those variables. The second thing that I think about in terms of value is just the economics of the problem, right? What is the revenue opportunity plus the loss aversion, right? Am I saving you money somewhere and am I making you money somewhere else? That gap is the value. And the real interesting thing that comes with sort of, at least in the consulting space, especially as you become a little bit more well known in that space, is there's this emotional contribution component. And really, it's still again very much this like time, sacrifice, efforts, like likelihood of success that it comes down to. But those are the two ways I really think about. I want to communicate value to the customer.
So you have this value equation, dream outcome times probability of success divided by time and effort. And that was really interesting. Like you can decrease the risk, make it easier, make it faster, or you can make them dream bigger. I hadn't thought of that before. That's a really interesting way of thinking about it. What you said at the beginning was pricing based on the outcome. So you kind of
Mhm.
gave the example, I think it was like a $15 million return on an investment, and you feel responsible for like 1% or something like that. I feel like that can be really straightforward. If you know the potential upside, you can have like a ballpark estimate, like 1%, 10%, and I can get the client to pay for that. One challenge I've found is that, when I was consulting in the past, was getting people to kind of open up about the
Mhm.
scale of the problem or like what's on the table here. And I feel sometimes people get defensive when you start asking them things like, what is this worth to you?
Mhm.
Because then they're thinking like, oh, well, will that make a difference in pricing? And sometimes people can get defensive. So I'm just curious, like how you navigate those conversations to kind of get a better sense of what potential upside you can create for your customers.
I mean, a lot of it has been having case studies where you can give them some kind of anchor to begin with. Other people I've worked with typically have invested $50,000 to $60,000 into something like this. If you don't think that's the return on investment, this is also probably not the right relationship to start. And usually, again, it's never the case that you say 60 and they go, oh, well, I only thought I'd be making $80,000. So a 20,000 profit actually doesn't seem worth it. It's either going to be, no, I'm pretty sure this is like a multi-million-dollar initiative. This is fine. Or they don't really know and they become really defensive. It's generally been pretty clear cut in my mind. For example, I was thinking about doing ads and I knew that if I could sell out the next two cohorts, I would make X amount of money. If I could generate three more clients, I would make about $80,000. And so the question is, how much would I be willing to invest to make that easier for myself? Advertising is one angle to do it. Content writing is another angle. And if you are a serious entrepreneur, you are writing down these numbers. And if someone came to me and they said, for $3,000, I could do some ad experimentation. And you know what, actually, Jason, how much do you think you'd be allocating to paid ads? well, the total revenue of the material is going to be like $200,000. Maybe 10% of that I want to reinvest into advertising. Okay, so you want to allocate $20,000. Now I know that ballpark is going to be the total you're going to spend, and I know some part of that is going to be the advertising itself. So I need to fit within that. But if your level of investment is $40,000, Jason, you're just too small of a customer, and I can totally understand that. Whereas at other times it could be, you know what, I generally only charge my customers $5,000. That leaves you $15,000 for advertising. Is that still of interest to you? I think if you're like a real entrepreneur, you tend to know the shape of these problems.
Basically trying to suss out how much they're willing to invest in whatever services you're offering. And then you also have this context of different case studies
Hmm.
that you can kind of compare against to see, okay, is that realistic? Is it not realistic? But once you have an understanding of what people are willing to invest, then you have a better idea of what the potential upside is because they've already done this math in their head back of the napkin.
Yeah, and if they haven't, again, I just, at least in the way that I communicate this, is like a part of me just feels like you're not that serious. And if you're not that serious, I can help you sort of size this up with you. But generally, people ought to know. Imagine a company raising a seed round. Okay, know what you're trying to invest. Your job is to spend the money that you raised to go make more money. You at least need to allocate $5 million into the seed round. And you generally have a good idea of how much you want to put into headcount, what the office space is going to look like. If you are running a business, I generally think you do actually have an idea of what you want to invest.
Yeah, that makes sense. If people aren't clear cut on how much they're willing to allocate or invest, they're probably not that serious and they're talking to you for whatever reason. Maybe they're just trying to research the landscape, they're looking for a
Yeah,
competing bid or that kind of thing.
exactly, exactly.
So, one thing I feel a lot of freelancers and just tech consultants believe, or one of the reasons they cling to hourly based pricing so much, is because one, AI projects can be notoriously difficult to estimate because maybe you get the data
Yeah.
and it's like really poor data quality. Now you got to spend all this time on data engineering and then you train a bunch of models and it doesn't really work. A laundry list of things can go
Hmm.
wrong. So they're hesitant to do like this
Yeah.
project based pricing or doing any kind of pricing beyond hourly because they don't want to like lock themselves into something but then it ends up taking twice as long as they
Hmm.
expected or something like that. So what would you say to like people that have that objection
Yeah,
to?
that goes to the first point we talked about in the beginning of what is the key takeaway, which is there exists a price where both people say thank you. Because if I could hypothetically say, you know what if you tripled your hourly rate, made the estimate, and you gave them that offer and they accepted it, right? And you think it would take 10 hours and end up taking 25 hours, you would still be happy. So if you are worried about some of these like unpredictability, what this really means is you didn't really underwrite the value. And if you think that's what the value is, you present that and that's not what they like, they don't really understand what the value is. This is again sort of the pains of working on some of these things where what is the thing that you're trying to sell? And I tend not to sell like a model or anything like that, right? Like I try to sell your ability to allocate your team better. I don't work with companies that don't have like 5 or 6 engineers. And the first thing I point to is, you know what? If you feel like you have 3 or 4 engineers spinning their wheels, that's $1 million asset. That is the anchor, is like you need to somehow allocate like this $1 million asset. And if I just ask myself, what's 5% of that? That's a general shape of what I feel good about talking about. Whereas if I just think of, okay, like they want me to train a model, there really actually isn't that much clarity on what the value is.
Yeah, I like this thinking of basically there's a number where you'll both be happy because
You have
kind
to
of
believe that.
it kind of forces you to kind of cut through and understand what is the client trying to achieve. Like, why are they asking you to train a model? You
Yeah.
know what I mean? Like, what's the
Yeah.
root cause? And then what number would make you happy to do whatever it takes to help them achieve that
Yeah.
dream outcome?
Yeah, and there's different ways of structuring it, right? Maybe someone comes back and says, "Oh, we want to have a better churn model because if we can do that, reduce churn." It's okay. Well, how many customers do you have? If you have 10,000 customers and they're paying $20 a month and your churn is 20%, maybe it isn't my problem. If you're losing $4,000 a month, that gives you that gives you another scale of what's going on. But if you have 100,000 customers, that is more valuable. And maybe that problem is hard. But if you knew that, you would feel much better charging more money because you can say, you know what, maybe what I want is to help you understand, hey, you're losing $100,000 a month. What is a $30,000 bet to figure out if we can stop the bleeding? What does that look like?
And a lot of this feels like positioning. So you talked about like helping startups allocate that $5 million. You talked about getting 3 or 4 engineers to stop spinning their wheels. So how do people start figuring it out? Because I feel like a lot of people, they might be coming from like a data science background, ML
Yeah.
engineering background. All they know is like how to do EDA and building models
Mhm.
and things like that. And they're not really thinking about these other kinds of things. How do you home in on those services that you are able to price in this value-based way?
I mean, there you definitely have to show some initiative. Like if you work at a company already, you definitely have to ask yourself, like, what is leadership talking about? What are their priorities? And very easily, if you go into one level above an IC and a manager is thinking about headcount. A manager is thinking about like, okay, I have a team of 6 people. What are the kind of projects I should put them on? How do I plan the roadmap? That's like a very simple manager level question, right? If you go one level higher to like VPs, maybe it's about a whole landscape of how to hire larger teams. How do you build out these teams? Maybe at that level, you're thinking about like acquisitions. Well, now a part of some of the companies I've worked with has been I have a huge relationship with people. I can get you to talk to that founder maybe and see what they're interested in. And at the highest level of a founder, you might be thinking about how do you do the next fundraise? How do you position the business? And a part of that value-based pricing is just understanding, you just got to go up this hierarchy. You have to somehow leave the world of like exchanging your time for money and just go up the hierarchy.
Yeah, I feel like this kind of comes back to that same point from earlier, where if you're coming from like this IC background and you're thinking
Yes.
about me, you're thinking about what does an IC do, and you're not thinking about your customer, who's
Yeah,
going to be like the VP of engineering or a senior director or a founder, CEO or
exactly.
something like that. You're thinking about the IC world, so you're just like thinking about the completely wrong
Yeah.
problems.
I mean, and you see this like even in just how resumes are being written. They talk about the work they did, but not the results they generated. It's one thing to say, like, I trained models at my last job, which is different than the models I built reduced fraud by 25%, right? Which is very different than the model I built that reduced fraud by 25% resulted in $80 million incremental revenue. And if you take a step back, you realize, oh, 80 million for Facebook is like a tiny amount. And actually, that's not that impressive. But 80 million for a seeds company, that's really fucking impressive, right? And that context, again, is basically how you present yourself. And the way you write your resume is the way you position yourself, is the way you even ask for promotions, right? It's the same thing.
How do you think people coming from this IC world, this employee mindset, this hourly
Yeah.
based pricing, how can they start to make that transition to more value based pricing and thinking about things from this like higher level perspective?
I think the first thing is figuring out what is actually at stake in the business and how do I communicate to the customer or the manager that I actually know what they want. If my employee came back to me and said, Jason, you know what I'm gonna do for you, Jason? I'm gonna work twice as many hours, but I'm gonna charge you the same amount. It's not what I want. Giving me a discount on your time and then working twice as much is actually not the point. There's something else I want to chase after, and can you figure out what that is? And then the second thing is another question I would really ask is once you have an idea of what they want, the question I would ask is, what if you doubled that? I was going to charge you $20,000, but what if I charge you $50,000? What else could I offer? Maybe for like a YouTube editor, right? Maybe the editor is like charging you some amount of money. This thing, what could I do if I charge twice as much? Oh, maybe I can offer some help with like researching content ideas, and maybe I'll also participate in some of the like thumbnail experimentation. If I charge 3 times as much, I could probably just hire a graphic designer. If I charge 5 times as much, maybe I'll hire the graphic designer and also, handle all the storage and give you like multiple versions of an edit. Like you can just double your prices and then just offer more things. But you just got to make sure that when you are offering these things, they're in alignment with what the user wants. But you can just offer these things now because you're not actually just an individual contributor. You're an entrepreneur and you can figure out how to create more value.
So it ultimately comes down to just understanding your customer's world, like understanding what they care about, understanding their problems, and then thinking bigger. Because I feel a lot of times we have these self imposed constraints or limits on our thinking,
Mm-hmm.
and we can't even fathom like charging. $50,000 for a contract, $100,000
Mm-hmm.
for $250,000 for a contract. But that what if, like what would that look like? What would it take
Mm-hmm.
to offer that level of service?
Yeah,
What would that look like?
Hormozy said this famous line. Says, it costs you $1 million to not know how to make $1 million. So if I charge you $100,000 where I tell you how to make $1 million, who wouldn't take that offer? And the entrepreneur basically says, if I give you this bag that's $500, the IC might go like, well, why do I want this bag? Like, why do I want to spend $500 on this bag? But the entrepreneur says, what's in the bag? If you tell me there's like $10,000 worth of gold, the only thing I care about is coming up with $500. That is the different mindset that you have to enter yourself in. Not how much does this cost, but what will this actually get me? And your job is to convince me that you know actually what you want to get me.
So that convincing part, it boils down to coming up with a compelling offer. So How do you approach that? How can people craft compelling offers if they're trying to sell their, independent consulting services?
I think the first one is just understanding where the company is in its life cycle and what are their like next couple of milestones. Earlier on last year, like I was really focused on basically recognizing that there were a lot of companies that had gone viral with these really great demos, and these demos don't do that but well in real situations, and they tend to lose customers. And so I could always list out these like three examples, and one of them is like this losing customers, and you kind of just like see on their face like, oh, that's the one there. You kind of feel like a mentalist. Like, yeah, sometimes people just like have a hard time hiring. Okay, no reaction. Or, you launch something, you go viral, and you just like losing a bunch of customers, like even no reaction. Or maybe, the team really just is just telling you guys that like the AI needs to be better, and you don't know what that means. There's the reaction. Like really what you're feeling is you're feeling very lost and you're spinning your wheels and you have this very expensive team and you want to make sure they're working on the right things and they're doing the research and pushing in directions that can build a product. Now that I know that, we can set some milestones. You got to build a product. Do you have a timeline? Is there like some kind of launch that you're pushing for? It's like, yeah, the CEO wants us to have something to share with the board in the next couple of months. We're actually planning this big pivot. Oh, wow. Okay. So you guys had raised $30 million last year and you're planning to do this massive pivot where the entire team moves over, but the team is focused on something else right now. Okay, what if I went in and de-risked the pivot? What if I came in with a series of prototypes and came back with a recommendation as to whether or not this is possible and come up with some recommendations on where the gotchas are and where the issues might be? What if I came in and told you what kind of technologies I'd really recommend and helped you build those relationships? What if I told you I had already done that for another client and I know exactly who to introduce you to get this done? And you wanted something in 2 quarters, but actually I have very strong recommendations what tools you need to use, and I know all the founders. So let me like send a couple emails right now and let me know like what next steps looks like. And now you're sort of presenting this thing like, oh man, like I'm really accelerating this timeline. And actually Jason understands that the pain is that I have this big team that's hard to steer. And what I want is to de-risk this pivot because this pivot is my entire fucking company. In that offer, we actually offer like a $500,000 offer, which is we're going to just bring in a team of 5 people for 1 month and we're just going to tell you.
So it goes back to the value equation, it sounds. So understand where the company's at in their life cycle and their milestones and what they're up against. So now you know their dream outcome. You're going to de-risk it. That's the probability of
Yeah.
you're going to do it fast because you've already done it for someone else. And it's going to be
Yeah.
low effort because you're just going to bring in 5 engineers to do it for them.
Yeah, and we've all worked together. We can communicate, and a lot of the proposal is really just going like, I just know what is actually in pain. You're not asking for a chatbot. You're asking if it makes sense to like change the direction of your business.
So this kind of goes down to talking to your customers about their lives and what they're up against. How do you start having those conversations? Are these people reaching out to you? Are you reaching out to them? A combination of the two? Like how do you spark these conversations and get like this gold mine of information?
I mean, a lot of it is just the fact that confidence is just the memory of success. As you go to your previous customers, again, the first thing you have to do is have to be thoughtful on what was the impact you actually drove, right? You did a bunch of work, but what were the actual benefits? And you can just ask them, like, "Hey, how did I actually help you?" For example, like ideally, if someone works with me as like as I help them through pricing, it shouldn't be, "Oh man, Jason's great. Jason had 6 Zoom meetings with me." That's not what I really want. What I would love is someone to say, "You know what? Jason actually gave me the confidence to quit my job, quit my FANG job." You know, uh, maybe that's an angle, and maybe someone actually said that, and so now I know. Okay, one of the pain points is there are FANG employees that want to quit their tech jobs, and they don't know if it's like a thing they can do. Another part of it is they want to become digital nomads. Or maybe another part of it is they have a hard time getting paid, and Jason has ways of getting paid up front. So now you have all these testimonials and these different proof points. And then when you have these conversations, your job is just kind of pattern match, right? You have different blog posts that have different hooks. You know which one they came in from. You know you know what they're going to do, and a lot of it is just sort of building that repository of case studies.
So it's like synthesizing information from a lot of different places. Like you're
Yeah,
making content, seeing what is the most engaging. You have past clients and testimonials, and you're kind of extracting what are the key things that they're talking about. And then you're also like you're continuously listening for these things, and you're tuned into these things when you're
yeah,
having future conversations.
exactly.
So we got one question in the chat. We will do Q&A, so keep them
Mhm.
coming and you can ask Jason all of your pricing and consulting or whatever questions you want to ask. But I got one more here, which I just thought of like before we got on the call. Why do you think consultants fail? Because I feel like a lot of people, maybe they're coming from like that FANG
Hmm.
background. They have a ton of technical skills, so they got the skills to pay the bills, but maybe they don't make it as an independent consultant, and then they have to go back and get another job. Like, why do you feel tech consultants, just don't make it?
Lead generation is definitely the big one, right? You just sort of die of starvation. Um, I think there a lot of it is just not really have a process of creating like a top of funnel, right? Are you doing paid ads? Are you like really aggressive with testimonials? Like you would not believe. I think last year I spent like 20 days on Zoom meetings and just doing a bunch of free calls and really just understanding like what are the core problems, right? Like it just takes a lot of work to start a business, and you might be one person, but it's still a business, right? Like you still have to work very hard to do these kind of things. And so just not really taking lead generation seriously is, I think, one of the biggest issues. Um, and I think the second thing is pricing. If you don't figure out your pricing, you're kind of just gonna be a little more unhappy, right? Uh, I think that's the truth of it, right? Like I think, at some point, like you do this because you want a different kind of lifestyle, you want a kind of some kind of freedom. If you can't get that in a certain way, it does get quite frustrating as you like like if you're too cheap, you tend to get bad customers. You tend to get not excited about the work that you're doing, and a lot of that can be just solved by pricing.
So lead generation and setting the right prices. I feel like every business's problem all the time is we don't have enough leads.
Exactly, it's because every business, right? You think that it's different if you build a SaaS company, or maybe it's different if you do like a venture-backed business. Turns out, it's like every business is hard. Like you're just
Yeah.
choosing your hard.
And it's interesting how much pricing can play into that. Like this, like what you said, that if you have low prices, you actually get lower quality customers. That was something I saw all the time on Upwork. It was when I increased my price, that's when I started getting, people reaching out to me or starting to get jobs that were actually, worth my time, or that I just wanted to work on. So pricing is a
Yeah,
huge lever.
yeah, because I think also, it turns out when I many times when I offer to help somebody for free, and I asked them for things like they're busy, like other work came up. But if I charge them $60,000, like no, 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 like you got to give me this thing, man. Like
Yeah.
I'm charging you so much, you have to kind of do this. Otherwise, it's not a priority. In which case, like, why are we here?
Yeah. You're only working with people who are serious and invested in like whatever you're trying to
Hmm.
do for them.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
So let's open up for Q&A. So we've got one in the chat. Keep them coming, guys, if you're on LinkedIn, YouTube, wherever. First one's from Shane. He said, giving a clear use case like reducing churn is a good example. How do you gather some metrics like this about the org before you get into that conversation? Seed with examples of previous improvements.
There's a couple of things, which is the only people who can answer these kinds of questions are the clear decision makers. Like if you're talking to like some engineer or some PM, there's a there's a real chance that these kinds of questions are just above their pay grade and they can't answer them. So part of it is actually just understanding, am I talking to the right person? And like I do this by on my website, for example, I show the companies I work with, and I also show my point of contact just to demonstrate sort of who I work with. And it's like company A, CEO, company B, CTO, company D, VP of engineering, right? It's never like junior PM that like DM me on Twitter, right? They can't answer these kind of questions. They can't be part of the value conversation. Once you build out a bunch of these different case studies, a lot of it is kind of the sales of just bringing these things up and just gauging the responses to them, right? I remember like earlier last year, I would just sort of tell this joke because one of the things I realized was just VPs in particular get really stressed out because it's the board at telling the CEO that the AI needs to get better. The CEO talks to the CTO, the AI needs to get better. And then it's the VP's head that's gonna get like, chopped if it doesn't work out. And so I realized that in the market, the VPs are really stressed out. And I would like tell jokes like, I bet really challenging to figure out when the AI is not working if the problem is hard, your team is bad. And some people just sort of like hear that and like look at me blankly, and then other people would like chuckle to themselves and like talk quieter for the rest of the conversation. And say, okay, you really need to upskill your team. You need to upskill your team. How many people are in your team? Oh, 8 people. Wow, wow. Okay. And I definitely think you probably need to like you're thinking about hiring too. So you need to upskill your team and hire like a couple more tech leads to bring in and bring some more expertise. That is actually the biggest priority. And all this prototyping and demos is kind of all these little, those are the trinkets. Those are the ways I'm going to upskill your team, right? But when I build a prototype and I write the demo and I give the talk, I'm not pricing myself on the time it took me to make that material. I'm pricing on the fact that this $6 million asset is going to do the right thing. On top of that, you're going to hire 4 people. That's another $2 million asset, right? So really, my job is to help you spend $7 million. And once I actually believe that, and once I'm aware of this, pricing at least like elicits some other kind of feeling, right? What is 5% of what that looks like? What is 20% of what that looks like? At 20%, I'm probably offering a ton. I'm probably in person a couple days a week. I'm probably helping recruit. I might be tapping my own network to bring in people, right? What can I offer at different percentages of value?
So it feels like you're getting a lot of these metrics to gauge the value in that initial conversation with the backdrop of you kind of have an idea of the company size and who you're
Yeah,
talking to and things like that.
yeah. And that just it just comes from working with smaller companies and knowing what their pains are and just charging for time, right?
Yeah.
Like you do this because you've seen all these cases, and that's why you've spent enough time that your job is now to make and help make better decisions.
So if you haven't had that direct experience with these situations,
Mhm.
do you still feel like there's a pathway for people to do the value-based pricing by, just kind of finding case studies online or, I don't know, trying to find them through their network or something like that?
I mean, I would love to believe so. It's just not something I've personally done,
Yeah.
right? Like I think it's just so much easier just to get some work, whether it's like free or for time, just to understand like what am I actually capable of doing.
Mm.
Like if you have a career in tech and you've already had these examples where you just, like I've led like a merger and acquisition, right? Like that's a case study. Like I can help. I feel good about helping you do that.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
because the acquisition, I'm not going to ask for 10% of the acquisition, but it's going to make me comfortable asking for either
A
ten
piece
thousand
of it.
dollars or $100,000.
Because you have that context, like
Exactly.
what's involved, the details. Okay, we got another one from Shane. Thanks for clarifying. How much time do you allow for exploration within the org before making your initial proposal? Um, it can get long if they drag their feet or are inefficient. What also feels like
Yeah.
you're like, I guess for context, like what is the typical company size that you're working with, and like things like that.
The ideal company for me is someone who's trying to raise a Series A. There's this like time urgency that is in the scale of like a year. Like if you want to sell them McDonald's, it's like a 2 year like period of negotiations, and they have like, they're working with McKinsey. But for me, it's like if a company has raised a Series A, has a their Series seed, has a product, trying to get to A, or after A, their job is to spend some money to demonstrate some capability that they can, make more money in the future. So they have money in the pocket to spend. They also have that time sensitivity where it's really going to only be a year. There's no way you negotiate contracts for 6 months because, even for me, at the stage of a seed going to an a weekly meeting is too slow. Like too much will have happened, and so they're inherently trying to move faster. So that's kind of like what the company looks like. And as a result, like I probably get most of my information in like about an hour and a half of conversations. But this is also because I have so many other case studies, right? It's not that I discover everything on the call. Really, what's going to be is it's what it's going to be is during the call, I'm going to make a bunch of comments on other case studies and see what resonates. I want to talk about a little bit of the challenges I foresee. I usually play a game of me predicting the problems they've had currently, guessing some of the problems they're going to have in the future, and also sending them a bunch of blog posts that I've written about all those cases. So this is a ton. I'm kind of flooding them with information. And ideally, when they come back, they're like, oh, Jason, like that was great. Like this blog post really stood out. And it actually turns out it's so funny that you made this prediction about what the kind of problems we're working on. I talked to the CTO. Those are the problems we're working on, and he's actually read the blog post, and that's when like, oh wow, like all these other sensors about their pains are being elucidated just from the content I've shared. And then by the second call, I was okay. I actually know that the issue again is like hiring. Like so many of these issues are actually just hiring issues. Is what I've realized.
So is that one 90-minute call, or is it multiple calls that you're gathering all
It can be
this
like 30-minute calls, like 30-minute calls.
30 minute calls. Interesting. All right. Well, I guess that's it on the Q&A side. If you guys got more, keep them coming. I did have one question on your
Yeah.
sales process. Like, what does that typically look like? So you mentioned you'll have these 3 calls. Is that, do you have like a standard sales pipeline? Or like, what does that typically look like?
I would say not too much. I can definitely be a little bit more systematic with my sales. I think during the time I was very like heavy on the courses, I tried to reduce the amount of consulting I did to sort of have more time. And so really what I did, like the goal is to figure out what is the top of funnel, what is the filtering and the friction I need to implement, and then what is the sales funnel. And so the friction would be, if I'm really busy, I have a type form. The type form basically asks all the hard questions. And if someone is willing to write down in a type form, like what is at stake in their business and whether or not they're interested in a minimum $60,000 engagement or a minimum $200,000 engagement, if they tell me that, holy cow! Like if I get one a quarter, I'm taking that call, right? When things are much slower, I'll remove the type form and I'll turn it to an email button. Right? That's kind of generally how that looks. So now, for example, I'm coming back from vacation. It's just a direct email. It just says like, "Hey, Jason, I'm interested in talking with you," and I'll just like jump on a call and talk to them. Um, and again, through this call, my main goal is to sort of just like list out these different pain points and just figure out what kind of customer you are. It very much feels like you're like the magician trying to guess, like you're like a medium. It's like you have a cousin or an uncle or a dad who love dogs, cats, the cats. Okay, you know, that's kind of the game that you end up playing.
All right, that's funny. So depending on how busy you are, you'll add more or less friction. More friction is really long type form. Less friction is just email me. Then the goal is to get them on a call, and then you just keep doing calls until you come up with a proposal, or what is that transition
I
from
will
first call?
generally
Yeah.
write a draft after the 30 minutes. Like I ask, who else needs to make this decision? What are you looking for in a partner? Um, what is really at stake in the business? Do you have like a general idea of like how much you want to fund or invest in some of these kinds of solutions, right? It's never like ideally it's never like fees and like how much things cost. It's just like what is the investment you're trying to make? And if you have an idea for an investment, what is the ideal ROI you want to make? Hopefully you're not paying me $20,000 to try to make $40,000, right? I don't want to do that project because it's so thin on the margin, right? It really should just be we're going to build this thing and then we're going to raise 2 million, right? Like, oh, okay, if I really want to communicate, I know what you want. Pay me half now, half when you raise. Now I really want you to raise that money, and as a result, because I know that, I know what else I can offer. Some introduction, maybe have a dinner with a friend who knows a guy who knows a guy. You know, that
I
becomes something that you can offer.
I feel like a lot of this just because it just comes down to being immersed in your customer's world, because then you can start to anticipate their needs, anticipate their
Yeah,
problems, be that mind reader, that medium
yeah.
that you're describing. Um, how do you? I guess this could be the last question, but like, how did you settle on the like your current customer avatar, like these startups trying to find that Series A? Because I feel like a lot of tech consultants at the beginning of their journey, they know they have skills, but they have no idea who they can help. So like,
Hmm.
what was that process like for you?
A lot of it was just like I would write blog posts about the problems I was solving and the things I was learning and the questions people were asking, and it just kind of you just kind of figure out, okay, well, if I write this blog post, these are the kind of people that are coming in. I had 10 people, 6 of them kind of asked the same question to me. Okay, let me write a blog post about that. I don't know what happened, but clearly these 6 people have something in common, and these 6 people came from this blog. You write that blog. The next thing is like, oh, actually, this is the issue. This is the issue. This is the issue. And I kind of just searched through, let's like writing about problems and questions that people are asking. At some point, it was like, oh wow, every person who comes in from the content I'm writing now is just this character, right? And it's probably because I am on Twitter more than I am on LinkedIn that it's like going to be a more like online founder who's like pre-seed, pre-series A. Like I'm sure if I did the same thing on LinkedIn, it'd probably be like a general manager or a VP. So kind of just like landed that way.
That's really interesting. You were just throwing things out into the universe and you just saw what came back at you. And then since you're just talking about your experience and you're posting a lot on X, this just turned out to be the customer that came that started talking back at you.
Yeah, and you kind of just figure out like what is a reasonable price to sort of anchor on. For example, you want to have like a minimum level of investment.
Mm.
So it's not to say that you would never communicate a price to say I'm really expensive or I'm really affordable. You just say customers that work with me tend to spend about $40,000, right? If that doesn't make sense for you, now you know. Like if you're not going to make a $40,000 bet, this might not be the right fit. And as long as you present options, this is what a $20,000 bet feels like. This is what a $20,000 bet recurring feels like, and this is what a $200,000 bet feels like.
I like that. Well, Jason, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your expertise with everyone. Thank you, Shane, for the questions in the chat. And with that, Jason, thanks again, and we'll see you guys in the next one.